What if the key to unlocking a future you never knew you deserved was hidden in plain sight, a relic from a past you never fully understood? What if a simple, almost forgotten object held the power to unravel a lifetime of hardship and expose a generation of lies? For one waitress, a single, courageous sentence spoken to a stranger was the spark that would ignite a firestorm of revelation, changing not only her life but the very foundation of a billion-dollar empire. This is a story about a lost ring, a stolen legacy, and a test of character so profound it could either shatter a woman's spirit or forge it into an unbreakable force for justice. The air in the Corner Spoon diner was thick with the scent of stale coffee and fried onions, a smell so familiar to Alara Vance that she no longer noticed it. It was the smell of survival, of another 16-hour double shift drawing to a close. Her feet ached with a deep, rhythmic throb, a painful drumbeat counting down the minutes until she could collapse onto her lumpy sofa bed. At 28, Alara moved with the practiced economy of someone who had spent a decade balancing plates and placating impatient customers. There was a quiet dignity in her movements, a resilience that her threadbare uniform and the weary lines around her eyes couldn't quite conceal. Every dollar she earned, every tip she pocketed with a grateful nod, was a small victory against the tide of medical bills threatening to drown her. Her mother, Lena, was the center of her world, a gentle woman with a kind smile and a body ravaged by a chronic illness that demanded medications with price tags that looked like typos. Alara's life was a relentless cycle of work, worry, and the fleeting, precious moments she spent at her mother's bedside, reading to her or just holding her hand. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. She dealt in the currency of endurance. The diner was mostly empty now, caught in the late afternoon lull between the lunch rush and the dinner crowd. A few regulars nursed their coffees, their conversations a low murmur in the background. The bell over the door chimed, announcing a new customer. Alara straightened up from wiping down a table, a professional smile automatically finding its place on her tired face. The man who entered was different. He wasn't one of their usual patrons. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair and a face etched with lines that spoke not of hardship, but of immense pressure and authority. He wore a simple dark suit, but the fabric and the cut were of a quality that whispered of wealth, not shouted it. He moved with a stillness, a self-contained gravity that seemed to absorb the diner's ambient noise. He chose a booth by the window, his back to the room, and stared out at the rain-slicked street. Alara picked up a menu and a glass of water and walked over. "Welcome to the Corner Spoon," she said, her voice soft but clear. He didn't look at her at first. His gaze remained fixed on the world outside. "Black coffee," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Anything to eat, sir?" He finally turned his head, and his eyes, a startlingly pale blue, met hers. They were sharp, intelligent, and held a profound, almost unsettling weariness. "No, just the coffee." She nodded and retreated, feeling the weight of his gaze on her back. There was something about him, an aura of lonely power, that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She returned with a steaming mug and placed it carefully on the table. He gave a curt nod of acknowledgement and returned to his silent vigil at the window. For the next hour, he sat there, nursing the single cup of coffee, lost in thoughts that were clearly a world away from the humble diner. Alara went about her duties, refilling salt shakers and restocking napkins, always aware of the silent, imposing figure in the corner booth. Finally, he signaled for the check. Alara brought it over, her mind already calculating how much she needed for the pharmacy refill tomorrow. He placed a credit card on the small tray without looking at the bill. As she reached for it, her eyes fell on his hand, and she froze. On the little finger of his right hand was a ring. It wasn't large or flashy, but it was utterly unique. A band of tarnished silver was intricately entwined with a delicate vine of warm, yellow gold. Nestled within the embrace of the two metals was a single, small sapphire, not cut with brilliant facets, but left raw and unpolished, the color of a stormy twilight sky. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Air seemed to vanish from her lungs. Couldn't be. It was just a coincidence. But the image was seared into her mind. A story her mother had told her 100 times. A fairy tale of a lost and better life. She described it with perfect clarity. The silver of her grandfather's resolve, the gold of her grandmother's spirit, and the sapphire from the small piece of land they had once called home. A symbol of their love, lost to the unforgiving tides of misfortune long before Alara was born. The man was watching her, his brow furrowed slightly at her hesitation. Her training, her instinct, everything screamed at her to just take the card, finish the transaction, and let him go. Don't cause a scene. Don't bother the customers. But something stronger, a voice that sounded like her mother's wistful memories, pushed its way out. Her hand trembled as she pointed. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I know this is a strange question, but that's a beautiful ring." She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to meet his piercing gaze. "My mother once owned one just like it." The man's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, interest, surprise, stirred in the depths of his pale blue eyes. He slowly raised his hand, examining the ring as if seeing it for the first time. The diner, with its buzzing fluorescent lights and the clatter of distant dishes, seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them suspended in a moment of impossible connection. He looked from the ring back to her face, his gaze intense, searching. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions, and Alara felt the terrifying, exhilarating sensation of having just stepped off a cliff without knowing if she would fly or fall. Arthur Sterling held his hand perfectly still, the ring a small, potent weight on his finger. Most people who noticed it commented on its unusual design, but no one had ever claimed a connection to it. He studied the young woman before him. She was clearly exhausted, the strain of her life etched into the fine lines around her eyes. Yet there was an undeniable sincerity in her gaze. There was no avarice, no calculated angle he had become so adept at spotting. There was only a raw, trembling vulnerability. "Did she?" he asked, his voice softer than before, the gravelly edge smoothed by curiosity. He gestured to the empty seat opposite him. "Sit. Tell me about it." Alara glanced nervously towards the kitchen, where her boss, Mr. Henderson, was barking orders. Sitting with a customer was against every rule. But the man's command was not a suggestion. It was an expectation of obedience, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who was never refused. She slid into the worn vinyl booth, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "My mother's name is Lena," she began, her voice gaining a little strength as she spoke of the familiar story. "The ring belonged to her mother, my grandmother. It was a gift from my grandfather, Joseph. He made it himself." Arthur's eyebrows rose slightly. "He was a jeweler." "No, sir. An engineer. A metallurgist, my mother said. He was always working with metals. He designed it to represent them. The silver was for him strong, dependable. The gold was for my grandmother, warm and beautiful. And the sapphire, that was from a little stream on the land they owned. He found it himself. It was their future," she said. Alara's eyes grew distant, lost in the inherited memory. It was the only thing of real value they had left. It was lost during a very difficult time. My mother was just a little girl. She never saw it again. He listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving her face. He seemed to be weighing every word, not for its truthfulness, but for its texture, its emotional weight. When she finished, a heavy silence settled between them. He slowly twisted the ring on his finger, the dull glint of the metals catching the dim diner light. "I acquired this ring over 30 years ago," he said, his tone measured and deliberate, "from a pawn shop in the old industrial district. The proprietor told me a man had sold it. A man who looked like the world had broken him." Alara's breath hitched. That fit the fractured narrative her mother had pieced together from her childhood memories. A sudden move, a father hollowed out by a grief and failure she was too young to understand. Arthur slid the credit card back across the table, along with a pen. "I'll need a receipt." As Alara scribbled on the pad, he took a slim, elegant wallet from his jacket and removed not a few bills, but a thick stack of them. He laid 5 $100 bills on the table. Alara stared at the money, her mind struggling to process the amount. It was more than she made in a week. It was her mother's medication for the entire month, with enough left over for groceries. "Sir, I can't accept this," she stammered, her cheeks flushing. "Consider it a retainer," he said simply. He then placed a crisp, heavy-stock business card next to the money. The engraving was simple, stark, and powerful. Sterling Enterprises. Arthur Sterling, Chairman. Alara's eyes widened. She had seen that name in the news, though not for years. Arthur Sterling was a legend, a titan of industry who had built an empire on revolutionary technology before retreating from public life entirely, becoming a recluse of almost mythical status. And he was sitting in a booth at the Corner Spoon. "If your story is true," Arthur said, his voice firm, "then this ring is not the only thing that was lost. We have something to discuss." He stood, his tall frame seeming to shrink the small diner. "Come to the address on that card tomorrow morning. 10 o'clock sharp. Tell the security desk you have an appointment with me. Don't be late." And with that, he turned and walked out, the bell over the door chiming his departure. Alara sat frozen in the booth, staring at the $500 and the impossibly important business card. Her world had just been tilted on its axis. Mr. Henderson chose that moment to emerge from the kitchen, his face a thundercloud. "Vance, what do you think you're doing sitting around with the customers? This isn't a social club," he snapped. Then his eyes fell on the money. His jaw went slack. Alara scooped up the bills and the card, her heart still pounding a frantic rhythm. "I'm sorry, Mr. Henderson. It won't happen again." She finished her shift in a daze, her mind a whirlwind of questions. Was this real? Was it some bizarre game played by a bored billionaire? Or was it, just possibly, the beginning of something that could change everything? That night, she sat by her mother's bed in their small, cramped apartment, the building's ancient pipes groaning in the walls. Lena was frail, her breath shallow, but her eyes were as bright as ever. Alara held the business card in one hand and relayed the day's incredible events. When she described the ring, a faint, beautiful smile touched her mother's lips. "The silver and the gold," Lena whispered, her voice raspy. "And the little blue stone from the creek. Your grandfather always said it was a piece of the sky that fell just for your grandmother." A tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. "He was a good man, Alara. A brilliant man. The world was cruel to him." "Mr. Sterling wants me to come to his office tomorrow," Alara said, her voice full of uncertainty. "What should I do, Mama?" Lena reached out a trembling hand and squeezed her daughter's. "You will go," she said, a flicker of the old fire returning to her eyes. "For your grandfather. You will go and you will find out the truth." Holding her mother's hand, looking at the impossible business card, Alara felt a seed of determination take root in the tired soil of her heart. For the first time in a very long time, it felt a little like hope. The next morning, the rain had given way to a crisp, clear autumn sky. Alara stood at the base of Sterling Tower, a monolithic skyscraper of black glass and steel that clawed at the clouds. It was a monument to a level of power and wealth she could barely comprehend. Her best blouse felt thin and cheap, her worn-out flats utterly inadequate for the sea of polished marble in the lobby. People in sharp suits glided past her, their faces set with purpose, their BlackBerries and briefcases like extensions of their bodies. For a moment, her courage failed her. She felt like an imposter, a trespasser in a world where she did not belong. Then she thought of her mother's hopeful eyes and the weight of the business card in her pocket. She took a deep breath and walked towards the imposing security desk. "I have an appointment with Mr. Arthur Sterling," she said, trying to keep her voice from shaking. The guard, a man built like a refrigerator, barely glanced at her. "Name?" "Alara Vance." He typed her name into his computer. His eyes widened slightly, and his posture straightened. He looked up at her with a newfound respect. "Of course, Ms. Vance. Mr. Sterling is expecting you. Please take the private elevator on your right, all the way to the penthouse. The elevator ride was a silent, stomach-lurching ascent. With each floor, the city spread out below her like a map, the cars and people shrinking to insignificant specks. The doors opened directly into a reception area that was larger than her entire apartment. It was a space of minimalist perfection, white walls, a single piece of abstract art, and a sleek desk behind which sat a severe-looking woman who introduced herself as Mr. Sterling's executive assistant, Ms. Albright. "Ms. Vance, Mr. Sterling will see you now," she said, her voice as cool and crisp as the air in the room. She led Alara through a set of massive oak doors into an office that seemed to hang in the sky. 3 of the 4 walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a breathtaking 270-degree view of the metropolis. The space was sparsely furnished, dominated by a single, colossal desk carved from a dark, rich wood. Arthur Sterling stood by the window, his back to her, looking down at the city he owned. He was dressed in the same simple, elegant style as the day before. "Ms. Vance, thank you for coming," he said, turning to face her. In the bright morning light, he looked even more formidable. "Please have a seat." She sat in one of the 2 leather chairs facing his desk, feeling small and out of place. He remained standing, studying her for a long moment before moving to sit behind the desk, the vast expanse of polished wood a barrier between them. "I have been thinking about our conversation yesterday," he began, steepling his fingers. "I have owned this ring for 32 years. It has been a curiosity, a beautiful object with a sad, anonymous story. Now you have given it a name, a history. I find myself compelled to know if that history is true." He leaned forward, his pale eyes pinning her in place. "So I will ask you to tell me everything again. From the beginning. Every detail your mother ever told you about her family. Her father, Joseph Vance. Her mother. Where they lived. What happened to them." Alara took a steadying breath and began her story. She spoke of her grandfather, the quiet, brilliant inventor who could see the hidden potential in things. She spoke of the small house with the workshop in the back. She spoke of the sudden, unexplained move, the descent into poverty, the shadow of a great failure that had haunted her grandfather until his early death. She had only fragments, pieces of a puzzle her mother had been too young to see assembled. Arthur listened, his expression unreadable. He asked sharp, incisive questions. "What was the name of the town? Do you know the address? What year did they leave?" Alara answered what she could, frustrated by the gaps in her own knowledge. "I'm sorry, sir. My mother doesn't talk about it much. It's painful for her. All I know is that they lost everything." He nodded slowly, seeming to accept the limitations of her story. "I believe you, Ms. Vance," he said, and the simple declaration sent a wave of relief through her. "I believe your account is genuine, but belief is not proof. And I am a man who deals in proof." He paused, his gaze turning towards the city below. "This company, this tower, it was all built on a single foundational patent. An alloy developed by my father, Elias Sterling. It revolutionized the aerospace and tech industries. It made us who we are." He turned his gaze back to her, and she saw a flicker of something deep and complex in his eyes, a question he had perhaps been asking himself for years. "I need to understand the origins of things, of this company, and now of this ring." He leaned back in his chair, a decision settling on his features. "Which brings me to my proposal. It is unorthodox. I would like to hire you, Ms. Vance. Not as a waitress, but as a consultant." Alara blinked. "A consultant? For what?" "A historical consultation," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I want you to work with me to uncover the truth, the full history of this ring, and the story of the family it belonged to. I will pay you a salary of $100,000 a year, and I will cover all of your mother's medical expenses, effective immediately." The numbers were so large, so far beyond her reality, that she couldn't process them. $100,000. All of her mother's medical bills gone. The crushing weight she carried every single day would simply be lifted. Tears welled in her eyes, and she fought to keep them from falling. "Why?" she whispered, the word thick with emotion. "Why would you do all this for a stranger?" Arthur Sterling looked down at the ring on his finger. "Because for 32 years, I have wondered about the man who was so desperate he had to sell a thing of such unique beauty. Because my father taught me that every debt must be paid. And because," he looked up, his gaze direct and piercing, "I have a feeling that if your story is true, my family may owe yours a debt that can never be fully repaid. Do we have an agreement, Ms. Vance?" Overwhelmed, speechless, she could only nod. "Good," he said, his tone all business once more. "Your employment begins now. Our first task is to trace the pawn shop where I bought the ring. It was on the corner of 8th and Sycamore in the old Foundry District. It was called the Magpie's Nest. That is where our investigation begins." Alara walked out of Sterling Tower an hour later in a state of profound shock, a contract in her purse guaranteeing a new life. The city streets, which had seemed so intimidating that morning, now looked different, imbued with a strange and shimmering sense of possibility. She had stepped off the cliff and, impossibly, she was flying. The first thing she did was call her mother's doctor to arrange for the best possible care, her voice breaking with joy as she gave them Arthur Sterling's name for the billing. For the first time, the future did not look like a dark, narrow tunnel. It looked like an open door. The first few weeks of Alara's new life were a dizzying blur. She was given a small, quiet office in the executive wing of Sterling Tower, a space that felt both luxurious and sterile compared to the chaotic warmth of the diner. Arthur provided her with a laptop, a corporate credit card for expenses, and access to a vast array of research databases. Their initial goal was simple: find any record of the Magpie's Nest pawn shop. Proved to be a frustrating dead end. The old Foundry District had been completely redeveloped in the late 90s. The gritty streets Arthur remembered were now lined with chic cafes and glass-fronted condos. City records showed that the building on the corner of 8th and Sycamore had been demolished in 1998. The business license for the Magpie's Nest had lapsed in 1991, and the owner, a Mr. Alistair Finch, had died 5 years later with no known relatives. They were chasing a ghost. "It's gone," Alara reported to Arthur, sitting in his vast office one afternoon, a stack of fruitless paperwork beside her. "The paper trail just stops. There's no way to know who sold the ring to Mr. Finch." Arthur stared out the window, his expression thoughtful. He seemed undeterred by the setback. "When one door closes, you look for another way in," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "If we cannot trace the ring forward from your family, we will trace it backward from mine." He swiveled his chair to face her. "My father, Elias, was an aggressive businessman. He expanded the company at an astonishing rate during the early 80s, the same period I purchased the ring. He kept meticulous records. Everything is stored in the corporate archives." He paused, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Perhaps the name Joseph Vance will appear somewhere in his correspondence. It's a long shot, but it's the only one we have." He made a call to Ms. Albright, and within minutes, Alara was being escorted down to the sub-basement levels of the tower. The air grew cooler, the plush carpets giving way to polished concrete. They arrived at a heavy steel door, which Ms. Albright unlocked with a keycard and a code. "The Sterling Archives," she announced, gesturing into the cavernous, climate-controlled room. Rows upon rows of tall metal shelves stretched into the dim light, filled with thousands of identical, acid-free storage boxes. The air smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals. "Mr. Sterling has granted you Level 4 access. You can review any corporate documents dated prior to 1990. Happy reading, Ms. Vance." The door hissed shut behind her, leaving Alara alone in the silent, intimidating vault of history. For the next 2 weeks, the archives became her world. She methodically worked her way through the boxes from the early 80s, her fingers growing dusty as she leafed through brittle invoices, dry legal contracts, and endless pages of financial ledgers. It was a monotonous, soul-crushing task. The name Joseph Vance was nowhere to be found. She began to feel a creeping sense of futility, a fear that this was all a wild goose chase, that Arthur Sterling's generosity would run out when she failed to produce any results. It was during her third week in the archives that she first met Julian Sterling. She was perched on a rolling ladder, retrieving a box from a high shelf, when a smooth, confident voice startled her. "You must be the family historian." She looked down to see a man in his late 30s, leaning against the end of the aisle. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with perfectly coiffed dark hair and a suit so exquisitely tailored it looked like it was molded to him. He had the same pale blue eyes as Arthur, but where his uncle's held a weary wisdom, Julian's glittered with a cold, cynical amusement. "I'm Alara Vance," she said, climbing down from the ladder. "Julian Sterling," he said, offering a hand. His grip was firm and cool. "CEO of this fine establishment, and Arthur's nephew. I've heard all about you." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "The waitress with the fairy tale. It's quite the story. My uncle, as you've no doubt discovered, has a soft spot for sentimentality. It's one of his few weaknesses." Alara felt an immediate, instinctive dislike for him. His tone was laced with a condescension that made her skin crawl. "Your uncle has been very generous," she said, her voice more clipped than she intended. "Oh, I'm sure he has," Julian purred, his eyes sweeping over her simple attire with dismissive appraisal. "He's taken a personal interest, given you an office, a salary, access to our most sensitive records. One has to wonder what you did to earn such trust so quickly." The insinuation was as subtle as a punch. "I told him the truth," Alara said, her chin lifting. Julian laughed, a short, humorless sound. "The truth is a flexible commodity, Ms. Vance. In my world, it's usually what the person with the most power says it is. And right now, you're digging through my family's history. My history. I have to admit, I'm not comfortable with that." He took a step closer, invading her personal space. "So let me offer a piece of friendly advice. My uncle is an old man, lost in the past. Don't mistake his nostalgic whims for a permanent state of affairs. This company wasn't built on charity or sob stories. It was built on strength and foresight. Remember that." He gave her another chilling smile, turned on his heel and walked away, his expensive shoes echoing on the concrete floor. Alara stood there for a long time, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and anxiety. Julian's message had been clear. She was not welcome here. He saw her as a threat. The encounter rattled her, but it also solidified her resolve. Julian's hostility felt like a confirmation that she was on the right path. He was afraid of what she might find. Later that week, Julian made his next move. He confronted Arthur directly in his office, his voice carrying through the thick oak doors. Alara, on her way to deliver a report, couldn't help but overhear. "This is getting out of hand, Arthur." Julian's voice was sharp with frustration. "You have a complete unknown, a waitress, sifting through our father's private papers. Have you lost your mind? What if she finds something embarrassing? Something she could leak to the press? This is a massive liability." "She is not a liability, Julian. She is a consultant." Arthur's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "And she is under my personal direction. You will afford her every courtesy." "A courtesy? She's on a treasure hunt, funded by you. She's chasing some ridiculous fantasy about a ring, and you're letting her compromise this entire company's security. It has to stop." "It will stop when I say it stops," Arthur stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "My father's records are my business. You would do well to remember who holds the controlling interest in this company. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." The door opened, and Julian stormed out, his face a mask of fury. He shot Alara a look of pure venom before striding down the hall. The next day, the obstacles began. The archivist, a timid man who had previously been helpful, suddenly became evasive. A series of boxes from the specific year Alara needed were in transit for digitization and unavailable. Her request for municipal property records for her grandfather's old address was mysteriously denied due to confidentiality protocols. Every path she tried to follow was suddenly blocked by a wall of corporate red tape. It was Julian. She knew it. He was using his power as CEO to systematically shut down her investigation. The pressure mounted. She was getting nowhere, burning through Arthur's money and time. The doubt that Julian had planted began to sprout. What if he was right? What if she was just a fool chasing a ghost? A pawn in a family power struggle she didn't understand. The weight of her new life, once a blessing, now felt like a burden on the verge of crushing her. She was failing and she was running out of time. The dead ends and bureaucratic walls were taking their toll. Alara felt a familiar despair creeping back in, the same hopelessness she'd felt working double shifts at the diner. She confessed her frustrations to Arthur, explaining how every lead now seemed to evaporate the moment she pursued it. "It's Julian," she said, sitting in his office, the skyline behind him a panorama of indifferent power. "He's blocking me at every turn." Arthur stared at his nephew's portrait on the wall, a corporate photo where Julian wore a smile that was all teeth. "Patience, Alara," he said, his voice calm. "A cornered animal is a predictable one. Julian is overplaying his hand. Tells me he is afraid. It tells me we are close to something." He turned to her. "Stop looking in the archives. Stop looking for external records. He controls those channels. Look somewhere he can't control." "Where?" she asked, exasperated. "Home," Arthur said simply. "Go back to your mother. The answer isn't in my history. It's in yours." The advice felt like a step backward, but she trusted him. That evening, she went not to her mother's new, comfortable care facility, but to their old apartment, which she hadn't yet had the heart to vacate. It was small, cluttered, and filled with the ghosts of their struggles. She had packed most of her mother's personal effects into boxes, intending to sort through them later. Now, she opened them, searching for anything, any clue. She worked late into the night, sifting through faded clothes, old bills, and cheap knickknacks. Finally, in a dusty box pushed to the very back of a closet, she found a small, locked wooden chest. Her mother had never mentioned it. On the top, a small brass plate was engraved with the initials, J.V. Joseph Vance. Her heart leaped. The lock was old and simple. She managed to pry it open with a screwdriver. The contents were not what she expected. There were no letters, no keepsakes. Instead, there was a single faded photograph and a thick, leather-bound journal. She picked up the photograph first. It was a black and white image of a young, handsome black man with kind, intelligent eyes, his arm around a beautiful woman with a radiant smile. Her grandfather and grandmother. And there, on her grandmother's hand, clear as day, was the ring. The silver and gold vine, the uncut sapphire. It was the first tangible proof she had, a direct link from her family to the object on Arthur Sterling's finger. Tears pricked her eyes as she stared at the happy faces, a portrait of a life before it was broken. With trembling hands, she opened the journal. The pages were filled with her grandfather's elegant, precise script, but it wasn't a diary of his life. It was a log of his work. Page after page was covered in complex chemical equations, metallurgical diagrams, and detailed notes on stress tolerances and heating points. It was far beyond her comprehension, but the passion and brilliance were evident in every stroke of the pen. Then she found it, a series of entries dated from the spring of 1981. Her grandfather described a breakthrough. He had created a new kind of alloy, lightweight, yet stronger than titanium and remarkably resistant to heat. He called it Promethean. He wrote with soaring excitement about its potential, its applications in everything from aviation to microprocessing. And then, another name appeared, a name that made the air freeze in her lungs. March 12, 1981. Met with Elias Sterling today, a sharp man with a sharper suit. He sees the potential in Promethean. He talks a big game, capital, manufacturing, marketing, all the things I know nothing about. He proposes a partnership. Sterling Vance Enterprises. A 50-50 split. Feels too good to be true. April 5, 1981. Elias is a force of nature. He has already secured a provisional patent office filing date. We will be partners. Equals. My darling Alara, her grandmother's name, is overjoyed. She says our ship has finally come in. I believe she is right. Alara's hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the book. She read on, her breath catching in her throat. The journal detailed weeks of meetings, of sharing formulas, of her grandfather handing over all of his research, his life's work, to his new partner, Elias Sterling. The final entry was dated May 20th, 1981. May 20th, 1981. We file the final patent tomorrow. Elias is handling the lawyers. This is the first day of the rest of our lives. I gave Alara the ring today, a promise of all that is to come. There were no more entries. The rest of the book was blank. Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, what had happened the next day. The foundational patent that had built Sterling Enterprises. The alloy her grandfather had called Promethean. Arthur had said his father, Elias, was the inventor. But it was a lie. It was all a lie. This wasn't just about a lost ring anymore. It was about a stolen legacy. A stolen life. The entire Sterling fortune, the tower she worked in, the money that was paying for her mother's care, it was all built on the ruin of her grandfather. The next morning, she didn't call. She went straight to Sterling Tower, clutching the journal and the photograph to her chest. She bypassed Ms. Albright and burst into Arthur's office. He was on the phone, but he took one look at her face and hung up immediately. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. Wordlessly, she laid the photograph on his massive desk. Then she opened the journal to the page describing the Promethean alloy. Arthur picked up the photo first, his eyes fixated on the ring. He then turned his attention to the journal. He read the entries slowly, his face growing paler with every word. He recognized the technical language, the descriptions of the alloy's properties. He traced the formulas with his finger, his expression a mixture of awe and dawning horror. When he looked up at her, the weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a terrible, gut-wrenching shame. "My God!" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Promethean." That's what he called it in his private notes. He sank back into his chair, looking like a man who had just been dealt a physical blow. All my life, I believed he was a genius, a visionary. He looked at Alara, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. He wasn't a genius. He was a thief. The air in the office was thick with the weight of the revelation. The truth, now unearthed, was uglier and more profound than either of them could have imagined. It recontextualized everything. The ring, the company, their very lives. It was a crime that had echoed through generations, and the silence in the room was its deafening sound. The discovery of the journal shifted the ground beneath their feet. For Arthur, it was an earthquake that fractured the very foundation of his identity. The father he had revered, the business he had inherited. It was all tainted. For Alara, the ghost of her grandfather finally had a voice, and it cried out for justice. Julian, however, remained a formidable obstacle. Through his network of loyal executives, he quickly learned that Alara had found something significant. He didn't know what it was, but the renewed sense of purpose radiating from his uncle's office put him on high alert. His campaign of obstruction had failed. It was time for a new strategy: co-option. He cornered Alara in the hallway near her office, his demeanor transformed. The sneering condescension was gone, replaced by a mask of sincere concern. "Alara, can we talk for a moment?" he asked, his voice smooth and reasonable. Privately, warily, she agreed, and he led her into an empty conference room, the blinds drawn against the city. "Look," he began, leaning against the long table. "I know we got off on the wrong foot. I was protective of my uncle, of my family's legacy. I see now that I was wrong to doubt you. It's clear you're not just some opportunist." Alara remained silent, her arms crossed, the journal a heavy weight in the bag on her shoulder. She didn't trust this sudden change of heart for a second. My uncle has told me about the journal you found, Julian lied seamlessly. He's told me about your grandfather, Joseph Vance, and his alleged contributions. This is, as you can imagine, a very delicate situation. He sighed, running a hand through his perfect hair as if burdened by a great weight. A public revelation of this nature would be catastrophic. Not just for my family, but for the company. For our 20,000 employees. Their pensions, their livelihoods. It would all be thrown into chaos. Stock prices would plummet. Lawsuits would fly. The media would have a field day, and in the end, everyone would lose. Your grandfather's name would be dragged through the mud right alongside my grandfather's. He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. Then he moved in for the kill. I want to propose a solution, he said, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. One that honors your grandfather's memory and secures your family's future, without destroying everything in the process. I want to offer you a settlement. He slid a thick envelope across the table towards her. Inside that envelope is a cashier's check for $10 million. It's yours. No strings attached. All we require is your signature on a non-disclosure agreement and, of course, the journal. Alara stared at the envelope. $10 million. The number was abstract, astronomical. It was more money than she could have earned in 100 lifetimes at the diner. It was enough to give her mother not just the best care, but a life of unimaginable comfort. It was an escape hatch from every worry, every fear she had ever known. The temptation was a physical thing, a sweet, seductive poison. Think of your mother, Alara, Julian pressed, his voice soft and persuasive. He had clearly identified her greatest vulnerability. You could buy her a house by the sea, hire the best private nurses. No more hospitals, no more uncertainty. You can give her peace. Isn't that what you truly want? This path you're on with Arthur. It's uncertain. A legal battle could take years, and you could end up with nothing. This is a sure thing. This was her test. The ultimate moral crossroads. On one path lay instant security, a life free from financial terror, an end to the struggle that had defined her existence. All it would cost was her silence. All it would cost was her grandfather's truth. On the other path was a fight, a messy, public, and uncertain battle for justice. It offered no guarantees, only the chance to restore a good man's name and reclaim a stolen legacy. Alara thought of the photograph of her grandparents, their faces so full of hope and love. She thought of her grandfather's elegant handwriting, the pages filled with his brilliant, passionate work. She thought of her mother, who, even in her sickness and poverty, had never lost her quiet dignity. Lena had never cared about money. She had only ever mourned the loss of her father's honor. What would that $10 million be worth if it was bought with the currency of their silence? It would be a golden cage, a constant reminder that she had sold her family's soul. She looked up from the envelope and met Julian's cold, expectant eyes. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed the envelope back across the table. My grandfather's name is not for sale, she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. And neither is my family's honor. A flash of raw fury crossed Julian's face before he masked it with a disappointed sigh. I think you're making a terrible mistake, Alara. A very naive and very costly mistake. The only mistake, she said, standing up and grabbing her bag, would be letting you bury the truth for another 50 years. She walked out of the room, her legs shaking but her spirit soaring. She had been tested, and she had not been found wanting. She went straight to Arthur's office and told him everything, the offer, the threat, the $10 million. Arthur listened, his expression grim. When she finished, he stood up and walked over to the portrait of his father, Elias, that hung on the wall. For a long moment, he stared at the face of the man he once worshipped. Then, with a sudden, decisive movement, he took the portrait down and turned it to face the wall. You did the right thing, Alara, he said, his voice thick with a mixture of pride and sorrow. You have more integrity in your little finger than my nephew has in his entire body. He turned back to her, his eyes blazing with a new and terrible resolve. He wants a fight, so we will give him one. No more secrets. No more quiet investigations. It's time to bring the truth into the light, no matter how much it burns. With Ilara's refusal of the bribe, the battle lines were drawn. Arthur, galvanized by her integrity and his own mounting shame, unleashed the full, formidable power of his position as chairman and majority shareholder. He was no longer just a reclusive old man. He was a titan of industry, awakened and enraged. "Julian has sealed off the corporate archives from you," Arthur said, his voice a low growl as they stood in his office. "But he has forgotten one thing. I built that system, and I have the master key." He led Ilara not to the sub-basement archives, but to a small, unmarked door behind a bookshelf in his own office. It opened onto a narrow staircase that spiraled down into darkness. "My father was a man of many secrets," Arthur explained as they descended. "He didn't trust banks, he didn't trust lawyers, and he certainly didn't trust his own partners. This is his private vault. Only he and I ever knew the code." The vault was a small, windowless room, lined with steel. Contained a single, massive safe. Arthur spun the dial with practiced familiarity, the tumblers clicking into place with loud, definitive clunks. He swung the heavy door open. Inside were not stacks of cash or gold bars, but dozens of meticulously organized, leather-bound ledgers and boxes of private correspondence. "Elias Sterling's true history," Arthur said grimly. "Let's see what he didn't want the world to know." For hours, they sifted through the documents, the silence broken only by the rustle of dry paper. And then they found it. A ledger labeled Special Projects 1981. It was the key that unlocked everything. The cascade of revelations began, each one more damning than the last. The first was a copy of the final patent application for the alloy. It was dated May 21, 1981, and filed under one name only, Elias Sterling. Tucked behind it was a memo from Elias's lawyer, confirming that he had deliberately submitted the solo application at 9:01 a.m., just moments after the patent office opened, ensuring it would be processed before the joint Sterling-Vance application scheduled for 10 a.m. that same day. It was a calculated, premeditated act of theft. "He stole it right out from under him," Ilara whispered, horrified. But that was only the beginning. In a folder marked J.V. Contingency, they found the next piece of the puzzle. It was a series of fabricated documents, faked letters and falsified order forms, implying that Joseph Vance was attempting to sell the Promethean formula to a rival aerospace company. "My God!" Arthur breathed, his face ashen. "When your grandfather must have realized he'd been cheated and threatened to sue, my father was ready. He didn't just steal the patent. He planned to destroy the man's reputation to silence him." Ilara felt sick. She now understood the shame that had crushed her grandfather, the shadow that had haunted her mother's childhood. He hadn't just been a failed businessman. He had been branded a traitor and a thief. The final, most terrible truth was found in a small, sealed box containing personal letters between Elias Sterling and his younger brother, Robert, Julian's father. The letters were cold, clinical, and utterly monstrous. One letter from Elias, dated a year after the patent theft, read, "Robert, the Vance problem persists. He has started a small workshop on the south side, trying to rebuild. He is a tenacious fool. We cannot risk him stumbling upon another breakthrough or gaining the credibility to challenge us. This needs a permanent solution." Robert's reply a week later was chilling. "Brother, I agree. An unfortunate accident can be arranged. The wiring in those old industrial buildings is notoriously faulty. A small fire could solve a great many problems. My contact in the fire marshal's office is, as you know, very accommodating." Ilara dropped the letter as if it had burned her hand. The difficult time her mother spoke of. The final blow that had forced her grandfather to flee the city. It wasn't misfortune. It wasn't an accident. It was arson. It was a conspiracy to utterly annihilate a man, orchestrated by the Sterling brothers. Arthur slumped into a chair, his face buried in his hands. The sound he made was a raw, ragged sob of a man whose world had crumbled into ash. The father he had idolized, the uncle who had helped raise him, were not just thieves. They were cruel, ruthless criminals. The entire Sterling Empire, the buildings, the wealth, the power, the very ring on his finger. It was all a monument to a crime of unimaginable cruelty. He looked up at Alara, his eyes hollowed out by the truth. They didn't just ruin him, he said, his voice a broken whisper. They tried to erase him from existence. He stood up and slowly, deliberately, slid the ring from his finger. The silver and gold band, the uncut sapphire. It was no longer a beautiful curiosity. It was evidence. It was the last remnant of a stolen life, a symbol of a debt so profound it could never be repaid. He held it out to her on the palm of his hand. "This," he said, his voice shaking with the weight of generations of injustice, "belongs to you, and by God, so does everything else." The emergency board meeting was convened the following morning. The air in the top-floor boardroom of Sterling Tower was electric with tension and confusion. The company's highest-ranking executives and board members, summoned by Arthur with no explanation, whispered amongst themselves, casting nervous glances at the head of the table where the reclusive chairman sat, a thunderous expression on his face. Next to him sat Alara Vance. Her presence was the biggest shock of all. She was an unknown entity, a ghost in their corporate machine, and her position at Arthur's right hand signaled a seismic shift in the balance of power. Julian Sterling arrived last, striding in with an air of feigned confidence, though a flicker of anxiety betrayed him. He had tried to get information from his uncle's office all morning, only to be stonewalled. He shot Alara a look of pure hatred before taking his seat as CEO. "Arthur," he began, his voice smooth as silk, "to what do we owe this unexpected pleasure? I trust everything is in order." Arthur didn't answer him. He simply nodded to the AV technician, and the large screen at the end of the room flickered to life. The first image that appeared was the black-and-white photograph of Alara's grandparents, her grandmother smiling, wearing the ring. "This was Joseph and Alara Vance," Arthur began, his voice low and commanding, silencing the room. "And this story begins with them." For the next hour, Arthur, with Alara at his side, laid out the entire sordid history. He didn't just tell the story. He presented the evidence with the cold, irrefutable precision of a prosecutor. He projected the pages from Joseph's journal, showing the original formulas for the Promethean alloy. He followed it with the image of the patent, filed under the single name of Elias Sterling. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Then he displayed the fabricated documents Elias had created to frame Joseph for industrial espionage. He followed that with the hidden ledger showing unusual, untraceable payments made to shell corporations. Julian began to squirm in his seat, his face losing its color. "Arthur, this is absurd," he interrupted, his voice strained. "You're basing this on the ramblings in a dusty old book found by an opportunistic waitress. These documents could be forgeries." "They are not forgeries," Arthur stated, his voice like ice. "They are from our father's private vault." He then projected the final, damning evidence. The scanned letters between his father, Elias, and his brother, Robert, Julian's father. The boardroom fell into a stunned, horrified silence as they read the words outlining the conspiracy to commit arson, to deliver the final, crushing blow to Joseph Vance. "My father and my uncle," Arthur said, his voice thick with disgust, "did not just build a company. They built an empire on the ashes of a good man's life. The inheritance that passed from Robert to you, Julian, was your father's payment for his part in this crime." Julian leaped to his feet, his composure finally shattering. "This is insane. This character assassination. You can't prove any of this. You're going to let this nobody," he spat, pointing a trembling finger at Alara, "and a sentimental old man bring down everything we've built? Think of the stock price, the shareholders. You will destroy this company." This was Alara's moment. All eyes turned to her. She rose slowly, her heart hammering, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady. She didn't talk about stock prices or shareholders. "My name is Alara Vance. she said, her quiet dignity commanding more attention than Julian's shouting ever could. My grandfather was a brilliant man who died in obscurity, believing he was a failure. My mother has lived her entire life in the shadow of a tragedy she never understood. You talk about what this company has built, but you have never had to think about what it cost. It cost my family everything. She held up the small, faded photograph. This is not about destroying a company. It is about restoring a man's name. It is about truth. Her simple, powerful words hung in the air, sucking the oxygen from Julian's blustering defense. The board members looked from Julian's panicked face to Alara's steadfast gaze, and they knew it was all true. Arthur Sterling stood, his presence filling the room. Julian is correct about one thing, he said, his voice ringing with authority. This will change the company. Effective immediately, I am invoking the Sterling Family Ethics Charter, which forbids fraudulent conduct by any officer of this corporation. Julian Sterling is removed as CEO and from his seat on this board, pending a full investigation by the authorities. Gasps echoed through the room. Julian looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. Furthermore, Arthur continued, his voice rising, it is the decision of the chair and controlling shareholder to right this generational wrong. Sterling Enterprises was founded as a 50-50 partnership. Therefore, I am ceding 50% of my personal controlling shares in this company to its rightful heir, Ms. Alara Vance. The boardroom erupted. It was an unprecedented, earth-shattering move. Alara felt her knees go weak, grabbing the back of her chair for support. Finally, Arthur declared, his eyes sweeping over the stunned faces. This company will no longer be defined by the sins of the past, but by our commitment to the future. We are establishing the Joseph Vance Foundation for Innovation, to be funded with an initial endowment of $1 billion, dedicated to supporting the brilliant, overlooked minds that people like my father would have crushed. He looked directly at Julian, whose face was a mask of disbelief and ruin. The Sterling legacy, from this day forward, will be one of justice. The aftermath was a whirlwind. Julian Sterling, stripped of his power and facing a litany of potential criminal charges, vanished from the corporate world, his name becoming a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms across the country. The press caught wind of the story, and for a few tumultuous weeks, Sterling Enterprises was at the center of a media firestorm. But Arthur, with Alara's input, handled it with masterful transparency. They didn't hide the ugly truth. They owned it. They framed the narrative not as a corporate scandal, but as a profound act of restorative justice. The story of the waitress who reclaimed her stolen legacy captured the public's imagination, and after a brief, sharp dip, the company's stock stabilized, then began to climb, buoyed by a newfound respect for its moral integrity. Alara's life was transformed beyond recognition. The title of billionaire felt unreal, a costume she was still learning to wear. The sudden wealth was disorienting, but her priorities were crystal clear. Her very first act was to move her mother. Lena Vance left the cramped apartment and the humming machines of the care facility behind forever. Alara bought a beautiful, sun-drenched house on a quiet, tree-lined street, with a garden and a staff of the finest private nurses. For the first time in decades, Lena could simply rest, free from the crushing weight of pain and poverty. One afternoon, Arthur came to visit. He and Alara found Lena sitting in a comfortable armchair by a large window overlooking the blooming roses, a soft blanket over her lap. She looked more peaceful than Alara had ever seen her. Arthur approached her slowly, a deep humility in his bearing. He held the silver and gold ring in his palm. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice gentle. "Lena, I believe this belongs to you." He knelt before her, the powerful billionaire before the frail, forgotten victim of his family's crime, and placed the ring in her trembling hand. Tears streamed down Lena's face as her fingers closed around the familiar, beloved object. It was a piece of her childhood, a symbol of her parents' love, a tangible link to the life that had been stolen from them all. She wept for her father's vindication, for her mother's memory, for her daughter's incredible courage. It was a moment of profound, painful and beautiful catharsis, the closing of a circle that had been broken for nearly half a century. The debt was finally being paid. 6 months later, life had found a new, quiet rhythm. Alara hadn't embraced the extravagant lifestyle her new status afforded her. She still lived simply, finding more fulfillment in her work than in wealth. The Joseph Vance Foundation for Innovation had become her life's passion. Working alongside Arthur, she reviewed applications from young, brilliant inventors from underprivileged backgrounds, people just like her grandfather, giving them the resources and support they needed to change the world. She had found her purpose not in having money, but in using it to ensure that no one else's legacy would ever be buried again. She and Arthur were sitting on a park bench, watching children play on a newly built playground funded by the foundation. The autumn air was crisp, and the afternoon sun was warm on their faces. Arthur was a changed man. The haunted, weary look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a calm sense of peace. In righting his family's greatest wrong, he had found a form of personal redemption. He had lost a father he thought he knew, but he had gained a daughter of the spirit, and with her a new sense of family. "You have your grandfather's eyes," he said quietly, looking at her. "He described them in his journal when he wrote about your grandmother. He said they could see the true potential in things. You have that gift, too." Alara smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile. "I just did what was right." "That is the rarest gift of all," Arthur replied. The story of Alara Vance and Arthur Sterling serves as a powerful testament to the enduring nature of truth. Poses a question to us all. What is the true measure of a legacy? Is it the wealth you build, the towers you erect, the power you accumulate? Or is it found in the integrity you uphold, the wrongs you right, and the honor you restore? Justice can be delayed for years, even generations, buried under layers of lies and forgotten by time. But it can never be truly extinguished. So long as one person has the courage to speak, one voice has the strength to question, the truth will always, eventually, find its way into the light. How many other stolen legacies are out there right now, waiting for just one person to be brave enough to ask a simple, world-changing question? If this story of truth and redemption moved you, please share it with others who believe in the power of justice, and subscribe for more inspirational tales of hope and vindication.